Autopsy doctors overread it. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? I am a pre-med student, and one time while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, he was doing an autopsy on an automobile versus pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain, they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and they cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered and bone fragments pulled back with the skin, and when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged and the eyeballs had been pushed back, fallen through the orbits and into the cranial cavity. The guy also had $10,000 in cash in his jean pockets. According to police, he had a record involving drugs, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out, there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they're made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh, right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before." While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe for head trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissor or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised, as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden the person was a crime scene and they had to call the police again and leave the person as untouched as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. When I worked for the ME office, a pathologist came and got all of us to check out a post she was doing. The guy had what's called situs inversus. All his organs were backward, left lung on the right, stomach on the right, etc, etc. No mention of it in his medical history. This is a copy with slight edits where I answered something similar before, but I am not a doctor, but I did an internship in a coroner's office for a summer. My job was to help with autopsies, clean up the office, dispose of old bags of organs. Bags with pieces from each organ are required to be kept for 5 years unless homicide, SIDS, or unknown cause of death, data entry, and other odds and ends. 2 stories that really stick out. On my first day I was to help with an autopsy of a homeless man who was living in a storage unit. Remind you, it's the summer. He was relieving himself in buckets that he also kept in the storage unit. He died in there and wasn't found for a month. Anyways, when we rolled him out into autopsy, you could smell him through the bag. It was so bad. I can't articulate how bad it was, but I was gagging and we hadn't even started. But then something weird happens. One of the techs puts a sheet down on the floor before we roll the cart onto it. I'm like, why? We're gonna have a disgusting stinky sheet now. That's when the bag is opened, and I don't see a body. I see hundreds of maggots crawling all over and they start to fall off the cart. I was then informed I had to stomp on all the maggots as they fell so they didn't spread throughout the building. So here I am, playing the worst game of Dance Revolution in history over a half liquefied skeleton holding my nose so I don't puke. The other story is that in the basement where we would keep all the organ bags and stuff like that, we also had notable objects from old crime scenes like murder weapons, etc. For some reason there were a lot of jars of fetuses, but that's a different story. Anyways, there was a butt plug in a bag that had the case number written on it. Now I found this during the first week of my internship, and I kept wondering, how does someone die by a butt plug? Now I had access to all case files as I had to enter data and all that jazz. So eventually I ended up looking up the case and it turns out an older guy had it in as he was jacking off to a magazine called The Spanking Times. Obviously he died as his butt plug was in our office, but the autopsy showed he had a heart attack, presumable as he climaxed. I suppose there are worse ways to go. I took forensic lectures so I saw quite a bit of crazy crap. But the things that stick is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the near mountains. It was very clear he died in an accident 20+ years ago. However, he had to be identified via DNA. Turned out his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show, cause the family was well known in my area. We found your son that went missing 2 decades ago. Also your wife cheated and I are with the Orbritha Havigadone. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable case involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farm hands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip up do happen from time to time. Holy crap, I get freaked out when my cat finds a stray rubber band, like produce rubber band, and pukes up the chewed up remnants. I can't imagine any creature eating metal wire. Totally not related but somewhat related. My sister-in-law works in medicine, and one of her classes involved studying and dissecting cadavers. One day in class they wheeled in a body and when they pulled back the sheet, a girl fainted when she realized it was her aunt. I'll keep this out of the main thread with the other unrelated stuff. Have a friend that was vegetarian because she had to attend dissections for pharmacy. Apparently slicing human muscle was too much like roast beef for her. Not a forensic pathologist or ME, but I occasionally liaised with an office as part of local print media in the aughties. Many fascinating stories, but the one that stuck with me, no pun intended, was from an ME who discovered, while dissecting a man's heart, that he had killed himself by first heating peanut butter to a liquid and then injecting it. It reached his heart and clogged it up, and that's an image my brain still loves to dwell on now and then. R.I.P. Reese's in pieces. I'm not a doctor but my uncle, dad's only brother, died when he was 17 in a car accident in 1975. They did an autopsy and told my grandparents he died on impact and didn't suffer. My dad personally knew the autopsy doctor and he told him that he didn't die on impact. He suffered for a bit and had internal bleeding and that's what ultimately caused his death. My dad hasn't and will never tell his parents. Bad accident during high school, missing scalp of young girl coroner couldn't find it. My buddy worked at impound yard and found it embedded in broken windshield frame glass. Pretty gruesome. As someone who is waiting on autopsy results from the coroner on a loved one, I find this incredibly fascinating and frightening at the same time. I'm not a pathologist but I work in a field adjacent to it. One patient was heart attack caused by CUs. The heart was apparently giant, like having to use C just to keep the heart going. My dad used to be a pathologist assistant and had to quit after a teenage suicide around the age of my brother, then a couple or 3 SIDS cases, which is sudden infant death syndrome, in the same week. I visited a dissection lab at a nearby university when I was in high school and one guy was laid out on the table in front. We asked how he died and the professor pointed at a jar and said that's how, and it was the guy's heart. It was bigger than his head. In college I took a figure drawing class and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it, so he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, have you ever found something weird in a body came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him, in particular not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds and so nobody recognized who he was. Unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had drug use and alcohol issues in his life and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it aside from that he was particular endowed and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies. So they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit and the teacher said sure, dissect his penis, see why it's hard still and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the penis itself goes untouched from their dissection, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspect it was done over 30-40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under the table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. When I was young, I knew a 19-year-old guy that was found dead in his apartment. The landlord was convinced it was an OD. Family asked for an autopsy. It was type 1 diabetes. He was undiagnosed. Probably felt like heck and went into shock and died. Very sad case. If he had gotten medical care in time, he probably would have lived. And then the police sent the bill for the autopsy to the family to add insult to injury. That was back in 1990. I'm a former police officer and attended several autopsies to record info for investigation files. One guy had been shot and killed, so the cause of death was pretty plain, but the pathologists doing the autopsy found a tumor the size of a walnut on his brainstem. He said the guy would have been dead in a few months even if he hadn't been shot. Another guy was dead due to a steak knife being stabbed through his heart by his wife. She claimed she grabbed the knife because she was scared he was going to kill her, and when he lunged at her the knife just went in. But when the doctor pointed out a half dozen or so marks that looked like freckles around the wound, he swabbed to develop a solution that clearly showed they were tiny little poke marks. I was able then to get her to confess that he was goading her. Go ahead, do it, until she hauled off and kebabbed him. It's not always like TV shows where the autopsy is the aha moment that solves a case, but sometimes it really is. Disclaimer, not a pathologist. In anatomy lab in medical school, we found one of the cadavers had a penis pump. There's a pump you squeeze in the scrotum that pushes water, stored up in a hard plastic water balloon in the abdominal cavity, into a tube in the penis. Other story I've told before, but I was dissecting the back of a knee when the knee implant, that I didn't know was there, popped out. For a brief, stupid moment I thought it was a Terminator and screeched. A month ago this guy had a bit of a bulge on the side of his neck. When we reflected the neck, this area got nicked and started oozing pus. Turned out this pocket had formed from a retropharyngeal abscess and he had pus tracking all the way down behind his esophagus and around his heart. One of the many stunning pathologies that showed up when COVID peaked in my area. Not an autopsy per se. Now unfortunately I have seen far too many people who have died, especially from being in combat. However, by far the worst thing I have ever witnessed was while I was home on leave. My brother-in-law, who was more like a brother in family than any person in the family I was adopted into. Long story on that one. Anyway, he was working up on the power lines and something happened, not sure what it was, that caused him to have to grab a something above him that was still hot as in powered up. He was extremely intelligent and very knowledgeable in his field. He had been an instructor for new people, so he really knew his business. As soon as I heard what happened, I rushed to his and my sister's house, and then we proceeded to where they took the body. The people suggested that my sister not look at the body for identification, and she said she had to, but asked me to go with her. He didn't look like the same person or really like a person. His hand was formed into a clawing type of position with it frozen in place and bent in the wrong direction in more than one place. The only thing I could make out of his facial feature was an indicator of some sort of mustache, though it was shaped in a very odd manner. The rest of his face didn't look human, nor did the way his body was twisted at odd angles that were not normal. And once again his other three extremities were at unnatural angles in multiple places. When he was alive he was around 6 feet 2 inches or 6 feet 3 inches tall, but what I saw was somewhere between 4.5 to 5 feet in length. This is by far the worst thing I have ever seen, and after the military I was law enforcement and was in watching autopsies frequently. How so many old people die that I am unable to explain the exact mechanism of death. If they have coronary artery disease, most do, and the manner is natural, not suspicious, but unattended. We just say MI. Late to the thread, so this will probably get buried. Disclaimer, I am a doctor, but not an autopsy doctor and had never really considered pathology as a specialty when I was in medical school. This event happened in anatomy lab when I was in medical school. In the preclinical years of medical school, most medical schools have students enroll in anatomy lab where we dissect cadavers as part of the course. One of the anatomy labs had a cadaver who had passed away from complications from kidney failure, according to the identification tab. While that anatomy team was dissecting some of the leg and buttock muscles, they found a bullet in the gluteus medius. No idea how it got there and totally unrelated to the cause of death. I like to imagine the guy signing paperwork to donate his body to science, thinking that the med students dissecting his butt would get a funny surprise. He might not have known you'd dissect his butt, lol. I didn't realize they do that and I am donating my body when I die. I just thought it was the head, chest and reproductive organs. My auntie is a coroner and she was told to expect nothing more than a gunshot wound to her pregnant female, which is what it was, but the bullet had killed the woman and 9-month developed baby who had the bullet pass through and end up in the palm of its hand like it was holding it. I hate this story. A suspect had been arrested for murder. During the autopsy it was determined the decedent had been shot post-mortem. Several hours post-mortem, the decedent's cause of death was an MI, so the suspect was charged with abuse of a corpse. It makes you wonder what goes through people's minds. Assisted with a post-mortem when I was a student. Female patient died in her 40s. Her medical history had extensive complaints of abdominal pains. One doctor even referred to her as a hypochondriac and others commented on apparent anxiety. Opened her abdomen and she had extensive scar tissue. She was absolutely massacred inside from endometriosis. She suffered for decades and never got referred for a laparoscopy. She didn't have freaking anxiety, she had a medical condition. I really hope someone sent that autopsy report to the doctor that labeled her a hypochondriac. My dad did autopsies as a night job while he went to college during the day. He said the hardest ones were the children. He did an autopsy on a 6-month-old whose mother suffered from postpartum and she told the cops that voices were telling her to put her son in the bathtub. She ran near boiling water and held him under. He said when he got to the hospital chunks of skin were falling off and the organs were liquid on the table. The other one he talks about are the people who are subjects of murder and they are buried. The decomposition process needs oxygen to break down cells and when they are buried it takes a lot long for them to decompose. When cops find bodies they unearth them and it takes a matter of hours for the bodies to decompose drastically. The smell of one particular individual that was murdered and buried in a cornfield for 6 weeks could be smelled from 3 floors above the operating room and was so bad that it was making patients and nurses sick. Something I found out because of an autopsy, not doing one myself. My brother died from a drug overdose, and I went to see his body. There was a seasoned medical examiner there and a new hire. The new hire told me that most of my brother's tattoos were gang related. The seasoned examiner looked at him like he was a moron. Wish he never told me. Nobody will care about this one and I can't blame them. But when else will I get to share this story? I was living in northern BC, Canada, and a friend of my then boss was found dead beside a lake with no obvious cause, so an autopsy was performed. He was, if memory serves, about 70 years old and in excellent physical condition. He had gone out on the lake in his boat and capsized, and swam back to shore, but when he got there he must have decided to rest, and fell asleep with his feet in the water. He died of hypothermia. I think of this a lot when I consider survival situations. Everyone, if you're in trouble, don't give up too soon. Don't quit. Don't stop to rest until you're sure it's safe to do so. Veterinarian here. We had a patient come into our clinic for some vague signs and quickly decompensate. We were unable to stabilize and the patient died. The owner was understandably distraught and began accusing us of a variety of malpractice issues. We offered to do a necropsy to determine cause of death. We're rural and there isn't a pathologist nearby, and I found a mass at the base of the heart. It had ruptured through the heart wall, filling the pericardial sac with blood and forcing a vicious cycle where the pressure from the leaking blood made it harder for the heart to beat. I took a ton of pictures and I'm incredibly glad I did because the owner submitted complaints to the board that we had killed her dog. Med student here. Had a guy OD on C which he frequently used. Was an alcoholic for 30+ years and had a history of seizures. Evidently he had been hit in the head with a baseball as a young adult and never saw doc. I went to take his brain out and this dude had a walnut-sized hole in his skull, and the brain underneath looked like someone had taken an ice cream scoop to it. He had been walking around 30 plus years with this hole in his head and having seizures BC of it. No wonder he started drinking. His liver was absolutely normal though. Standard, not an autopsy doctor, but medical student, and did dissection on a few cadavers. The one I remember best died of metastatic bowel cancer. I remember dissecting his lungs and being confused by the marble-like hard lumps in them. MFW, I realized they're little metastases and this poor man would have had trouble breathing in his last days among a host of other problems from his bowel cancer. Have the greatest respect for those who donate their bodies for medical education. Thank you, John. There was this girl my mum grew up with on an army base. She had a really long plait she used to chew on in her sleep, and she choked to death on a hairball once. Apparently it was the size of a kiwi fruit lodged in her throat. She choked to death on a hairball once. Once is usually all it takes. Not a forensic doctor, but was very interested in the field when I was doing my internship, and our forensics professor was a minor friend to me. He let me in the criminal autopsies frequently and can't remember exact details, but there was a special case where a partial body, bones and rotten flesh was found on the beach. The professor thought it was a murder case by the marks on the bones. A forensic entomology team worked on the case also. I mean, it was the most interesting way of work I've ever seen. It's like beekeeping, but it's with maggots and flies. They investigated the whole life cycle of the flies, found the type of the bug and found where that fly belongs to. It was apparently washed ashore to the beach from the neighboring country and the woman went missing a while ago. Craziest crap I've seen. I've also seen a body died of autoerotic asphyxiation and rigor mortis condition, but that wasn't as interesting for me as the entomology case. My mom's very first autopsy lab was a lady who had died in a restaurant bathroom. Turns out she starved herself to eat at a buffet but ate too fast and got sick. She aspirated succotash and my mom got to see all the whole lima beans in her lungs. My mom still won't eat them to this day. When she told me that story, I've never been able to see Sylvester's catchphrase the same way ever again. Saw a post-mortem at uni. Guy pulled out a giant colon then peeled it back on the bench to reveal a huge foot-long and probably 6-inch diameter cigar of impacted crap. Dude died because his bladder burst from the pressure. Also had a load of coins in his stomach, resulting in inappropriate jokes about lunch money. Not a doctor, but in a dissection of an extremely emaciated cat in biology class, we found a small piece of cellophane blocking the flap in the stomach that leads to the large intestines. The poor kitty had been able to eat but starved to death because her body was unable to extract nutrients from the food. Not really an autopsy, but when I was in anatomy I saw someone had sciatic nerve ran right through the butt muscle. I can only imagine how much pain he was experiencing when he was alive. Sometimes bodies become swollen or bloated. It's a fairly normal thing. Depending on the position when they died, some parts swell more than others because of pooling blood. There was this one old man who died in a car crash. Not uncommon, as older folk can have slow reaction times. It was a fairly straightforward autopsy. He ran a red light, was hit, and died on impact. However, a few days later, some of the swelling still hadn't gone down. Usually only lasts a day or two, but this guy was pitching a tent long after it should have become flaccid again. So they do some digging. Turns out this man had an implant for erectile dysfunction. One of the testes was replaced by a little pump, and an inflatable cylinder was placed in the penis. He was fully inflated at the time of the accident. They determined that he was probably masturbating in his car and became distracted, causing the accident. Being a state's medical examiner gives you some weird crap to look at, but I can't say what state, just that it's on the eastern seaboard of the US. So if you recognize this by chance, you know me. There was a multiple homicide, that occurred in which a few people's skin was carefully peeled off, sexually violated, and dumped in a field. It didn't matter what color, gender, the only link was the most of the poor people were single parents. It eventually tallied to 6 people before an MO was established, but the community dragged him in first. Anyways, the cause of death one would assume is shock, and most of his victims either died from that or OD on H. His push of choice, but I had found something odd in one lady's toxicology report: propoxyphene hydrochloride and double the legal limit of alcohol. All the signs opioid abuse was there, but it didn't seem to line up with her health info or the established MO, outside of her obvious lack of skin, etc. I probably shouldn't have said anything, but I talked with a friend in the running investigation to find out more about her, and there was a final query made on her personal life. It turns out that she had been getting back together with father of her kids, and he had been poisoning her every night they had dinner, and from my understanding, when she blacked out, was sold to the killer in question, not wanting to pay child support. Dad is a doctor. Poor motorcyclist hit a pole head first at 80 miles per hour, was motionless and had no pulse but looked fine on the outside as he had a helmet on. Dude's brain had severed in half. Not an autopsy doctor, but a story I heard from my local sheriff. The local department found a guy that killed himself by shooting himself while on a fire that burned up his body pretty bad. The autopsy doctor found out that he was full of bullets and was hoping for bullets to go off as his body burnt away. I've always been amazed by people who have died in fires. You'd be surprised at how pristine the internal organs are in someone who has been completely immolated. I had one dissident who I discovered died of a simple heart attack, dropped his cigarette and burned his place down. Cops were sure it was a homicide because the guy had a rap sheet a mile long, but nope. Here's my personal favorite from forensics class. A suicidal guy rode a bicycle for about 50 miles to get to the middle of nowhere. There, he climbed a radio tower, bringing his bicycle along to the top, drank a lethal dose of poison, mercuric cyanide if memory serves, then shot himself with 2 handguns simultaneously, one to the chest, one to the skull, and jumped. Died days later of hypothermia. This entire thread is just making me miss that show Dr. G. Medical Examiner, where every episode was just stories about autopsies she had done. My mom loves this story. My aunt got accepted into nursing school, but had to get prerequisites done in the summer. She knew someone who pulled some strings, and she was put into a pre-med class that taught pretty much the same thing as one of her nursing classes. She was the only woman, and because she has always looked younger than she is, and she was only 20 to begin with, and she's really pretty, all the pre-med students groaned and complained that she would hold the class back. Anyway, time came for the cadaver lab. The dissident had been in a car accident. The lab director and professor kept telling them that they weren't looking for a cause of death. It had already been determined. They were just looking at the anatomy. My aunt was looking over the x-rays and asked, what were the circumstances of the accident? My grandpa was a firefighter paramedic, so she knew that was a huge thing. The professor is like, we're not looking for the cause of death. We told you, it was trauma from a car accident. My aunt responds, there's a small spot on his kidney right here on the x-ray. They went and checked the kidney, and sure enough, there was a tiny tumor in his kidney. Based on the size and placement, it was determined that the tumor would have caused excruciating pain similar to a kidney stone. Based on that information and the nature of the car accident, they said the man either blacked out from the pain while driving, or had a sharp, sudden pain that caused him to lose control of the vehicle. They had to change the death certificate to add that to the contributory causes, and my aunt also set the curve for the class, and, 2 years later, she passed the boards with a top score. While in labor, my cousin was literally born 3-4 hours after my aunt pretty much aced the boards. My mom just informed me she merely passed the boards. My mistake. I'm glad the pre-med students didn't hold her back. What a brilliant woman. Well, I DK about revelation to their death, but I work in a cadaver lab at a university, and we once found a brain with a massive hole preceding the third ventricle, essentially a chamber for cerebral spinal fluid. The patient was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but we think it had something to do with that ventricle. We had several neurologists look at it and none had ever seen anything like that. Died of something random I can't even remember. Not me, but I read a story of a guy that drank antifreeze because he was freezing to death, and it actually worked for a bit before he died a terrible death from the antifreeze. On the plus side, he showed up to the morgue already embalmed. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.